excited. And also knowing that we changed days. So thank you all for letting us change days this week. We had a lot of things happening yesterday. There was the finance meeting, which Astrid is going to talk about. And there was also a full day symposium on male engagement that happened in East Africa, but that was open to many participants and was translated into like 5 languages. So I know IRC was also one of the presenters at that. So a lot is happening. And there was also a side meeting on CRSV at the Human Rights Council that was supported by the US, and the director of the UNFPA Geneva office participated in that with Patton. So a lot happening yesterday afternoon. So thank you for moving to today. So we're going to get started. We're switching around a little bit the agenda, as I mentioned, but I know some people have joined since then. And we're going to start with Astrid, who is going to give a bit of an update on some very exciting work that's been going on around tracking what funding is actually going to women and girls for GBV. And you know, we're trying to also get a better understanding of what's going to gender-based violence, and more specifically figuring out what is going to women-led women rights organizations. And I see that we have a few other people here who were part of those meetings. And so after Astrid presents, I would be very open to anybody else contributing. I see that we have Constance and Catherine and others, so definitely feel free to add after Astrid speaks. So I will hand it over to you, Astrid.
Thank you, and I'll be quite brief. I just thought it made sense to update for those who were not in the meeting. So there's been this GBV funding gap task team where Catherine and Constance and several of you have been part, Anna as well. I think it's been led by Jessica Skinner from the UK, started for a long time on her own, and then she handed over to Kate Latimer, and Alina Minshew and I joined over the last months to help convene and build up to the technical GBV financing meeting. Now, it was a technical level meeting that took place yesterday. I think one of the reasons why we did get very good participation, and we tried to build it to bring in voices from outside the GBV community as well, so that we get out of our echo chamber, right? And then really hear what others think is the reality and what's practically feasible. It was a follow-up to the roundtable on GBV financing that was with at the principals level already a year and a half ago. And then, as many of you know, Denmark has been promoting for the last month that we should do another follow-up meeting at a high level to keep the momentum and the prioritization of funding to GBV. I think what was interesting yesterday was at least some of the achievements is we managed as a task team. So this was everyone on the task team to really, in preparation for the meeting, we made a discussion paper that can be shared. I imagine we can share it quite openly now that the meeting has been done. But basically, I think now we know we have a better view of the funding situation. We've sort of looked at the different resources and the different methodologies to collect information. From the AoR side, we can see that in terms of funding levels, according to FDS, we're at 6%, which is not a lot. If you take out Ukraine, we are at 3% level of funding, sector-wide funding so far this year. So not a lot is an understatement. Then again, we've done with our GBV coordinators from the field who fed into the GPC tracking tool. So been working with the GPC on tracking, having coordinators and partners in the field explain, report the funding that they have received. So it's more real time. In that report that came out for the GPC thermometer event this month, we actually are at 20% funding levels versus an average for protection across the AoRs of 27. So it's higher than FDS. At the same time, I think for every sector, the real situation is, is better than what you can see in FDS because of the lag, the kind of reporting and the lag in time. What's been positive as well, and I think from our side through the GPC, is that there is definitely much more that needs to be done in terms of getting funding directly to local actors, women rights organizations, women-led organizations, but local actors in general, I think as well. According to our coordinators through the GPC tracking, we actually have 23% of the funds that go to the HRPs, so to the recorded funding at the interagency level through our partners. 23% ends up with local actors, but there's only a small portion of that that goes directly. Otherwise, it goes through UN agencies and INGOs. So in the end, it ends up in the hands of local actors, 23%, but it's not when it goes through UN and INGOs, I think it straight away reduces the time frames and makes it less flexible as well. So there's a need for more flexible funding. Anyway, that was sort of to frame. So yesterday, many of you were on the call. The aim of the meeting was to find out, to look at problem statements that Lina Minshu had taken the lead in drafting and looking at our assumptions. The first problem statement was around HCT prioritization, and is it the lack of HCT leadership? What is that is required to get a stronger prioritization of GBV funding in decisions at country level? And then the second problem statement was around women-led organizations, women rights organizations, what to do, next steps to increase direct funding to these organizations who are increasingly, we hope, becoming part of a meaningful coordination within the AoR field level. So those were the two main bulks. I think on the HCT discussion, the sort of the solutions that are still very draft, but seem to be the most supported, let's say, by the participants. It was around building on the OCHA policy, where it says that HCTs have a role, and GBV being one of the core non-negotiables for HCT leadership, actually finding a way to include what that means into an annual evaluation, maybe the annual evaluation that takes place of all operations in February, or at least have a way to benchmark what that means. And then the second recommendation was around, again, we would have to look at what it means in practice, like triggering some kind of collective action when funding goes beyond a certain level. And what does that look like? Is it the subcluster, or is it the HCT, or how that happens? And then on the discussion on women-led organizations or women rights organization, the discussion, I was not in that group, but the discussion went a lot around, I think the final conclusion was around, we need to land on a final definition of what we mean by that, and we have to probably include local women-led organizations into that definition so that they also agree on the self-definition of what they are, and then using that definition for tracking. I don't know if Lina or Kate are here, because we kind of improvised because what I'm talking about is a huge team effort. It's many of you have contributed over months. And I think from our side, we were happy. We had one person from our operations who usually works with our IPs and gives advice on that. So around what kind of IP agreements we can have, etc. And then we did have our rep from Ukraine and the UNFPA rep from Myanmar, as well as the deputy from Mali. And I think from our side, we really wanted them also to hear from everyone else, and also input in terms of their experience of trying to advocate, and successfully and sometimes less, for GBV prioritization. With that, I'm going to hand over to Jennifer and whoever else wants to say something.
Yeah, I thought we have Emily Krasner also on. So Constance, Emily, I don't think we have Elena since Sarah is here. But if anybody else wants to add anything about the meeting that happened yesterday, and just to say, The thermometer event that Astrid was referring to is an event that happened for the second time this year, where the protection cluster has a specific tool that they use to ask the protection cluster coordinators and the AoR coordinators at the country office level how much funding has been contributed towards the humanitarian response plan. It's called thermometer event because it's looking, okay, we're halfway through the year. Where are we at compared to our ask and what we've actually received? And donors are invited to this meeting with the hopes of trying to address the gap that we always have of what we're asking for and what we're actually receiving. And that's where the 21% came out of where we're at for the GBV AoR, which is the least funded out of all of the AoRs next to the ask, not in terms of the total amount of money. And so just to let you know, that's it, because the other mechanism that OSHA offers is the FTS, the funding tracking system, which is not as up to date at every moment, which is why the thermometer event is conducted. So does anyone want to add anything from the meeting from yesterday on the finance? You don't see any hands, but you're welcome to take off your mic and just speak. Yes, and I see that Astrid wrote in the chat that the IRC also presented their annual financing reports, which I think are also very interesting. So if you haven't seen them, I assume they're all on IRC's website. Is that correct, Sarah Mosley?
Yeah, they're actually on the website, to be frank, somewhere. But if you go to gbvresponders.org, they're also under, and they're much easier to find, and they're under their reports or publications tab.
Okay, and that's something we can also put in our next monthly update for people. So yeah. Okay, I'm gonna just quickly give an opportunity also to Manisha, who's online, to say a few words on the call to action event that happened in Copenhagen very recently. And again, there are many people on this call who attended in person. There are others who attended online. So if you want to add anything after Manisha speaks, then feel free. Go ahead, Manisha.
Thanks, Jennifer. Can you hear me okay, or do I need to put my headphones in?
No, that's perfect.
So I have walked away from that annual meeting and tried to put it out of my brain. So forgive me for being a little bit all over the place because Jen just asked me to do this now. So it was the annual Call to Action Partners meeting in Copenhagen, the 15th and 16th of June. The second day became largely about the grand bargain and localization because Denmark is co-chairing that now with IFRC, and they wanted to have outcomes that they could take to the grand bargain meeting in Geneva this week. So it was a much shorter call to action meeting than originally planned. But it started off with a high level segment with a number of people from HCR, IOM, Norway, Germany, and in gender health, talking about the role that leaders have to play in terms of making sure that organizations and individuals understand GBVs everywhere and they need to respond to it, and that it's a longer term commitment. We then also had a bit of a setting of the scene with UNFPA Rep Ula Muller from Nigeria, where they're really trying to put the call to action Northeast Nigeria roadmap into practice and really getting some of that political leadership and push behind that to really make it happen. And that also means looking outside of the kind of the call to action bubble and really looking at who else can be brought in, whether it's in terms of government, different parts of the development actors, other actors as well. We then also had a presentation on what's coming out of the progress report for the 2021 roadmap implementation. I don't remember anything from that presentation, even though I did it. So my brain's a fog, so I can't tell you. But we then had breakout groups starting to look at what we can do around a number of questions on the roadmap, things around kind of making it much more accessible. What do we mean by GBV so we get others on board? Trying to make sure that we're not conflating gender equality and GBV so that we get people working on both, finding ways to hold governments to account, because the call to action really was set up originally to hold each other to account, but it feels oftentimes that NGOs and agencies are the ones that are being held to account by donors and not the other way around. There were also calls for an internal review into the call to action governance to reflect more of the transparency, new ways of working, having more kind of a marketplace to share how we're putting our commitments towards the roadmap so that we can maybe have more shared commitments and really trying to do things more collectively around the roadmap, since the roadmap is 2021 to 2025. So we still have another 3 years, give or take. So there's a lot of opportunities there where we can be putting things together, but also looking at that financing task team from the call to action, looking at the good work that's happening there, using that as sort of an example that can be done also for advocacy and localization, I think was the other one that had been suggested. So really finding out how we can do that there. And on day 2 with the localization elements, I think there's a lot of calls around the fact that, local organizations do have capacity. It's about, there's all this talk about putting them at the front line. So how do we put those words into action? And just as Astrid was saying, how do we get them more flexible, multi-year sustainable funding so that local organizations and not just women-led organizations have the ability to really be able to respond, but then also recognizing that they're not monolithic and that there are power dynamics also between local organizations and women-led organizations that we need to be also considering, and that we need to be also supporting them when they're shrinking space for their operating abilities as well. And then I think we ended sort of with a bit of an overview of what the different working groups are doing, the IOs, the NGOs, and the donors. I didn't take any notes on that. So I don't have any notes on that, sorry. But they're moving ahead on work. It's not very good.
Thank you, Manisha. And I did put Manisha on the spot because I saw her on the call. She'll probably never come back to another call again. I hope that you do, Manisha, look into the chat. You're getting lots of appreciations from your great facilitation at a very complex environment at Call to Action. So please note the chat. And just to say to everyone, I was just asking for sort of, since this meeting just happened, that we have just a quick sort of few words from Manisha, and that was much more comprehensive than I had envisioned. But I will talk to the different the different working groups that are part of the steering committee of Call to Action for the next call, to have them present a bit more information on what's next and what's the follow-up looking like. So so thank you, Manisha, and yeah, you have lots of positive comments, so please absorb them. So now we're going to go back to our regular agenda, because I said we had kind of switched things around a little bit. And I also want to just welcome, there's some not new people, but newly coming to this call, people from the past. So it's really nice to see them. And I also am excited by the number of coordinators who are on this call. And just to say, we're very excited that next week is our coordinator annual event in person. Woohoo! We're very excited about that. And we have a really good representation of LACRO, which will be the first time we've had so many countries coming from Latin America and the Caribbean. So that's new and that's exciting. And so we will definitely share what comes out of that meeting at the next call. But we're all very excited about that, and a number of the coordinators are on this call. So, and we did also have an AoR half day before Call to Action and a half a day after Call to Action, but we haven't had a chance to prepare with anything to present now, so that can be on the next call as well. So we're now going to hand over to both Alina Potts from GWI and Eri, Eri, I'm not sure how to pronounce your last name, Taniguchi. I hope you can say it for us, because I should know how to pronounce it by now. Who is the coordinator with UNFPA in Myanmar. And this is this project, I believe, has been presented before on an AoR call when we were talking about BHA funded projects that are being done with some contributions from the AoR. And this is also a project that's being supported by TROCARE, but this is going to be specifically looking at Myanmar, which GWI was the one who took the lead. So that's why it's just GWI and Myanmar on this presentation. Over to you, Alina and Eri.
Thanks, Jennifer. Hi, everybody. Nice to see old faces and also new ones, or old screens, I guess. We're not really seeing faces. And also to say our Chokra colleagues, Fiona and Priya, are on the call. So obviously, if you want to jump in at any time, we will kick off by giving just an update on the project, and also realizing perhaps not everybody heard the original presentation when we introduced it. So I'll quickly recap it, give some updates on where we are overall, and then Eri will share a deeper dive on our consultation in Myanmar, which we co-led with UNFPA Myanmar. So next slide. Next slide also. Again, thank you. So this project, why this project, why now? This project focuses on building consensus between GBV and MHPSS actors to ensure survivor-centered support when MHPSS services are provided for GBV survivors and those at risk in humanitarian settings. So it recognizes that currently there's a lack of consensus on safe, effective MHPSS interventions for survivors and those at risk, including what constitutes safe practice and what doesn't. And, you know, this is partly the product of separate bodies of professional knowledge, of the histories of how MHPSS and GBV have evolved as sectors of humanitarian response. There's many reasons for this, but out of conversations that happened at the AoR and other fora, you know, there was a recognized need to really move towards consensus. So the project built on those discussions, and it takes the form of a participatory process called a Delphi process or a Delphi study, which basically is a way to engage experts where there's consensus lacking, and over time, over a series of questionnaires that build on each other, build towards consensus on those areas where consensus is lacking. And so by doing this, we can reach an empirically supported clear set of principles and recommendations for MHPSS with survivors. Next slide. So, you know, there's many ways that the current lack of consensus impacts survivors. I think I don't really need to tell many of you what they are, but just to say, you know, where there's divergence, where even what maybe one sector is promoting practices that are considered harmful by another, we see that quality of care can be impacted, the ability to coordinate care can be impacted, and outcomes for survivors can be impacted. So from our initial conversations and key informant interviews we had for the proposal development and the kickoff of the grant, we identified some key areas where practice diverges, including around mediation or couples counseling in cases of IPV, use of in vivo exposure in group settings with GBV settings, or GBV survivors, and I should say that extends to other kinds of exposure therapy, application of trans-diagnostic tools with survivors of violence, management of suicidality, and attention to safety within service provision. So these are some of the areas that we've been focusing on. There's been a few more added. Next slide. And then you can see the key kind of stakeholders and sites of engagement. So this is looking at, if we think broadly around, you know, MHPSS for GBV survivors, we've really tried through the proposal to include these key stakeholders and sites of engagement in different ways. So we have an advisory group, which is actually half of the membership are women-led local organizations, and half are from UN, INGO, and academic actors or research actors involved in this, many of those named here. And also we've been, you know, sharing at the AoR, at the MHPSS reference group. We've also met with the minimum services package team and been working. We have, as we will share here, several ways of working also at more localized levels to ensure that this is not only a global practice, but it has touchstones with practitioners working in specific contexts to connect to what's going on in those contexts, what can we learn from them, and then how can we feed that back up into this global participatory process. Next slide. So, oh, sorry, there's some animation here. You might need to keep going for all the bullets to show up. I didn't realize that. So our project period is 18 months. We started at the beginning of the year and we go through mid next year. And we've done a number of things so far. We finalized our desk scan on MHPSS and GBV in humanitarian settings, so we can share that out. We've held our first advisory group meeting. As I mentioned, many members of the AoR and the ISC MHPSS reference group are members, and half the membership are WLOs, women-led organizations. We worked with all of these actors. So many of you were involved in helping us develop a sample, a proposive sample. So meaning we asked, who's involved in this work that could contribute from their practice and their experience, expertise. GBV and MHPSS experts and service providers. So they represent a broad and very global swath of context, experiences, knowledge, and skills. If you can hit it just a few more times. We've begun the Delphi survey to identify areas of consensus and areas for further discussion and analyze findings. And we've just closed our baseline questionnaire, which was the first part of that process. So we had 68 responses, because I let somebody respond this morning after the deadline, but 68 responses. And we're now in the process of gaining responses in round 1. And so round 1 is available in English, French, Spanish, Arabic, and Burmese. So we're actually managing the survey in 5 languages to make it really accessible and really global. If you could just click, I think, twice more. And the idea is that the baseline gives us some key information about the sample. Round 1 is a series of open-ended questions about the areas of divergence that I highlighted and a few others that came up through the desk scan. And so based on responses to round 1, that's qualitative data, we analyze it. And then in round 2, we come up with a series of statements, and respondents will rate their degree of agreement or disagreement with each statement. And then we consolidate that. And in the next round, we reflect back to each respondent what their score was on that statement and what the group score was. And they can decide whether they want to move further towards it or away from it. And in each of these rounds, they can also give reasons why, or they can say, I agree with this part, disagree with this part, or I think this should be added. So over time and looking at these statements, we can kind of come towards where there's convergence and where we can see more, we're moving towards consensus. And then there may be some particularly sticky issues where we need further focus on really unpacking those. And that's kind of part of where we're going at the end of this, which would be identifying ways to take that forward within the available for us. So we have organized and co-facilitated our first national consultation in Burma around areas of divergence, and to learn from that context, that's what Eri will share more about shortly. Next slide. And as I've said, we have some upcoming activities. So completing the round 1 analysis and sharing the round 2 questionnaire would be one of those. And I just shared kind of what that looks like in more detail. We also will be hosting a sub-national consultation in the Ghetto region of Somalia. And so again, this is one of these field kind of grounding points or touchstones throughout the global process, where we're then sharing back, what we found so far through the survey and having practitioners in that context reflect on it. And Fiona and Priya are leading that one. So if there's questions about that, they can also speak to that in the Q&A. We have funds, and I really want to highlight this point. Actually, if you remember a little else, remember this. We have funds to support key engagement processes by specifically supporting AoR members to attend things. So for example, if there's key meetings on GBV and MHPSS around the minimum services package, around other areas, we actually have funding to support people to attend. And so we've asked our advisory group members, to let us know what they would like to go to, what they need support to go to. But if there's other areas where AoR members need support, please get in touch with us. I can put my email in the chat. Because again, the grant runs for another year, but we'd like to make sure that we're able to support AoR members to engage and to be part of those conversations. So if you could just click twice more. Towards the end, gone through our next rounds and to incorporate, validate, and consolidate the learning from the previous rounds of the Delphi survey. We're planning this for East Africa, either Ethiopia or Kenya at the end of the year. And then we'll also be having validation and advisory workshops at key points throughout. So the advisory group meetings are virtual for now, and we'll have one in person next year. And then at the, our main outcomes are really to identify these points of consensus, remaining sticky areas, and develop materials in a variety of formats. So these can be kind of short briefs, but also in a report, but also things like videos, infographics, communication tools in local languages, so that we can really ensure this information about, okay, here, this is consensus-based, survivor-centered ways to move forward, that we're getting that information out to the people who need it in formats that they can really metabolize it. And we'll be disseminating really widely and, depending on all of you and these platforms to help do that. Next slide. So just to say, this kind of concludes the global, very rapid project recap and update, but we have been and will continue to engage fellow GBV AoR members and also the MHPSS working group at the global level with organizations represented on the advisory committee, participation in the Delphi process. So many of you are also enrolled in that process as respondents, and also reviewing, giving final input on the final products. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eri to speak specifically about our learning from Myanmar.
Thank you, Alina. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Jennifer, you pronounced my name correctly, so don't worry. Okay, so if you can move to the next slide. And yeah, the next one. So I would like to share some key highlights from the consultation that we had in Myanmar, which was on 16th and the 17th of May. So it was a bit more than 1 month now. So maybe just to start, and this was also presented during the consultation workshop. So in terms of the context for Myanmar regarding MHPSS and GBV. So in Myanmar, we have very limited mental health, especially like human resources and also available services. So what is existing is mainly like hospital-based institutional care, but also after the military coup, this hospital is not well functioning. So it, in terms of the service availability, it's very limited. So this also leads to the need for more community-based mental health and the psychosocial support, MHPSS, and also this is given the protracted conflict and displacement, also ongoing conflict and displacement, and then again COVID-19 since 2020. And all of these factors are also exacerbating GBV risks. We can really see that the MHPSS interventions are well integrated in humanitarian response, even though like mental health resources are limited, and especially so for GBV and the child protection interventions. And when we also look at community-based MHPSS, GBV caseworkers play a very important role in providing community-based and focused psychosocial support, and we have been also investing in this area. Last year, we also had a joint meeting for GBV subcluster child protection area of responsibility and the MHPSS working group. And we had also productive discussion and identified some of the issues and challenges, which include limited service availability and also common problem regarding sensitivity and the stigma around discussing about GBV child protection MHPSS, importance of self-care, staff care for the caseworkers, both for GBV and the CP, and also like a need for trust building for referrals, and also to facilitate timely referrals among GBV child protection and MHPSS actors. Next two slides. I will skip for now because I want to focus more on the highlights from the discussion, but later you can also look at it. We have identified some of the key issues for MHPSS and the GBV, also as per the MHPSS pyramid and the different levels. So objectives of the consultation that we had as part of this project, I think it's also quite similar to what Alina already mentioned. So the first is to understand experience of providing MHPSS services to GBV survivors, especially focusing on what is the current practice, if there is any area of tension between MHPSS and GBV actors, also if there is any area of convergence or divergence in practice. And then also to understand how MHPSS and the GBV actors are working together or not. Next, please. Yes, so in terms of how we structure the workshop, unfortunately, we couldn't organize in-person workshop, so we did it workshop online for 2 days. And we know that how exhausting the long online meetings could be. So we broke the sessions into shorter sessions of 90 minutes. And then we also had like 1 hour to 90 minutes break in between so that we can really focus on each session after break. We had 33 participants in total. But also I think we had a very good thing that the majority of the participants were Myanmar nationals. And I think more than half of the participating organizations are actually from local CSOs, women-led organizations, women's rights organizations. We arranged English and the Burmese simultaneous translation because most of the participants are Myanmar nationals, and we wanted them to also freely express their views and they share their experiences. We had a lot of group discussions and like a breakout room. So those group discussions were also facilitated in Burmese as much as possible. And I think we really also thought that this like ensuring that the participants could speak and share in their own language was also quite important for this workshop. Next, please. So I think I will just highlight the key issues. We had a very rich discussion, but we cannot share everything here. So just a few points for each area. So the first session focused on mediation. And I think we had also quite active discussion in the areas of mediation. Overall, we found, I think, convergence rather than divergence between GBV and the MHPSS actors in terms of mediation and our approach to the mediation. So participants also shared how they are dealing with the mediation or like whether they are involved or not. But I think consensus that we have reached is that the mediation is not recommended for GBV cases, including intimate partner violence. Instead of the mediation, what GBV service providers can do is to sensitize religious leaders and community leaders who may be actually facilitating the mediation on the survivor-centered approach and support the survivors before or after the mediation. In terms of managing suicidality, we found that there is a huge also like a capacity building needs in this area. And most of the organizations participating didn't have organizational policy and the protocol in terms of how to deal with survivors with suicidal ideation. Some organizations received training in this area, but most of the GBV partners didn't receive these cases so often. So again, like after the training, they could not utilize the skills, and then like they they are not so confident also to deal with the survivor with suicidal ideation. In this area, we also had a strong convergence between GBV and the MHPSS actors that the confidentiality is a priority except for high risk cases. Next, please. So another area we have looked at is trans-diagnostic models. And for Myanmar, we have especially looked at CETA, Common Element Treatment Approach, which is implemented by Johns Hopkins University. So this is also quite flexible intervention that can treat different problems. But in Myanmar, CETA has been implemented since 2014, but not necessarily targeting the intimate partner violence. And also, I think the good aspects of CETA is that it can be provided by lay providers, non-specialized person, but with a sustained period of mentoring and supervision. Then I think, yeah, not only for CETA, but also for other different MHPSS approach, there was a discussion that while also there is a need for structured approach to support GBV survivors, but I think, yeah, the more we have like a longer sessions, we see less client adherence. So client may drop out, yeah, during the sessions and then not necessarily completing the whole sessions. So also I think we have to see what's the balance between these two elements. In terms of the peer support for GBV caseworkers, I think yeah, also in the same situation as in any other countries, but especially since COVID-19 and also after the military coup, there is a much more like a stronger recognition of the needs of peer support, also staff care, self-care for the GBV caseworkers. And we have identified different also good practices that the participating organizations are already implementing. But I think even though they are already implementing some of the staff care, self-care, but it is not necessarily as part of the organizational policy. And I think the participants also indicated that this should be part of the organizational structure, organizational practice, so that it is institutionalized. Another point, I think, which is also quite interesting, is that the participants also said that this is because self-care, staff care is also very important issue related to also the quality of care. So again, there is a need to also advocate to donors to allocate dedicated budget for peer support and the staff care. Next, please. Yeah, so this is the last area that we have discussed, which is child and adolescent survivors. Yeah, I think maybe most of the participants came more from GBV side, not necessarily from child protection side. So many organizations also share the difficulties and the challenges in responding to child and adolescent survivors case, especially when it has to involve the communication with parents and the caretakers who may have different views, different wishes, different decisions than the child and adolescent survivors. So I think also in terms of the a Myanmar culture, what children say is not taken seriously, and also they don't feel comfortable also speaking in front of their elders. So this also a cultural factor also needs to be considered when providing support to the child and adolescent survivors. So I think this is also the area that our partners expressed that they want more capacity development support. Next, please. At the end of the workshop, so we also did a reflection because I think throughout the 2 days we shared also quite intimate or like sensitive topics to discuss. So we wanted to kind of like close the circle by doing the reflection. So you can see some of the words that describe how the participants feel at the end of the workshop. And I think we can really see positive words like inspirational, sharing, motivating, linking. So I think, we found that I think this was quite a positive experience for all of us in the workshop. And also, I think, our participants also appreciated that they could interact directly with those coming from the global level, like also Jennifer. We also had Carmen from MHPSS reference group, also Virginia from UNICEF. So they also enjoyed this interaction. Next, please. So just I think a few words as a conclusion that we have identified as the next steps for Myanmar. So I think, we have identified some of the areas that the more support is needed in terms of like a suicide assessment, also psychological first aid, and also especially, there is a need for organizational policy protocol for managing suicidality. The participants expressed, I think a lot of interest in CETA technical training and other MHPSS approach, as well as also how they can better support child and adolescent survivors, etc. And also the need to further closely work between GBV actors and MHPSS actors also to facilitate the timely referrals. So I'll hand back to Alina for the global level next step.
Shiva, I think you need to go back one slide. I think there was a conclusion there for Alina. Maybe. Yeah. Alina, we can't hear you if you're talking.
That's because I'm on mute.
Yeah.
So thank you for managing the slides also. And I wanted to quickly respond to Constanza's question about community-based MHPSS. So you'll see the fourth bullet here under national follow-up next steps. It does touch on that because it did come up in the consultation. It links to this bullet about interest in knowing more on how to the availability of professional psychological services and referral, and also MHPSS professionals to support community-based MHPSS. And it was mentioned too in the consultation that there was an MHPSS working group joint meeting with GBV and child protection clusters in April of 2021, where participants talked about limited service availability at the community level and the sensitivity and stigma around all of these issues, gender-based violence, child protection, MHPSS. So I think that's, there's some specific barriers in the Burmese context, but it did come up, and we haven't analyzed we still have round one open, so we haven't analyzed that yet. So once we analyze that, we can also speak more to what comes up on the global survey. So, and yeah, thank you all for your comments. I think, you'll see globally next steps. We had in this consultation specifically, a call for enrollment in the study. So that's now been completed. And then also we went through the findings from the consultation and made sure those were reflected in how we developed our initial questionnaire. I should have put round one here instead of baseline. And that's been completed, that's out now and being responded to. And then finally, we're continuing, to follow up, and we'll be checking back in with the GBV and MHPSS working groups in Myanmar to share results of the study. So it's great, again, to have these very global project, but make sure that we're grounding it in specific context as well. So we'll open to, oh, before we do that, I'll say one more thing about the consultation. Just the format, I think, Eri described this, but it really was about listening. We had some, we had co-facilitators from different organizations, and we had some key areas and some questions, but really it wasn't to deliver content. It was really to ask those questions and then allow space for people to discuss and share. So I think that led to all of the things that you just heard, really hearing the challenges and hearing in a lot of depth, challenges and then also needs. So we'll open it up now for any further questions. Yeah, and thanks also, Rebecca, for your note in the chat about how difficult it is supporting child and adolescent survivors across settings and the need for simplified interventions and protocols.
I wasn't sure if Carmen was on the call because it looked like a Carmen name attached to a telephone. So I'm not sure. Carmen, if you're on and you want to add anything about the Myanmar experience, feel free.
Yes, and Carmen actually facilitated that session on child and adolescent survivors. So it would be a great person to speak further to that if she's on.
Yeah, I can't tell. It's so when people use phones, it's harder to track who's on. So maybe it's a different Carmen. Any questions? I know there were comments that Alina kind of already responded to in the chat, but if you still have a question, you wrote a comment, feel free just to take your mic off and ask. We're fine on time because we have blocked until 4:30. So we actually are good on time today, so you can ask questions. Or if you want to share your comments verbally. No, I'm not seeing any hands. Please feel free just to take your mic off and speak. No, nothing. There are comments in the chat. I don't know if you, Eri and Alina, are you both able to see?
Yeah, I think we kind of had a robust Q&A in the chat. So we've responded, and I've responded to the last two verbally. So, and I'll just put my email, and if you have any further questions or comments, you can reach out that way.
And just to say, because I saw Fulvia on the line, in terms of the actually Delphi method for the whole of Syria Voices report that comes out every year, they've been using this particular method for quite some time now for their different working groups and qualitative response. So if anybody has questions around the methodologies, in addition to communicating with Alina, you can also ask Fulvia about that particular. It's interesting to hear how it is being used where it's not in person, but online. So I think, I don't know if whole of Syria has maybe now moved over to online methodologies, but I did get to be part of one that was in person. It was a very interesting methodology. So it's always good to hear of new research methods. Great, so thank you so much for that presentation. And I think there's a lot of positive responses. And just to remind people, we do at the AoR have a task team on MHPSS and have been also trying to find out more about what actually is the situation in the field. So for those of you who are coordinators online, one of the reasons that we have been working together in discussions with MHPSS reference group is because we recognize there is a difference sometimes in approaches, and that if there are issues, definitely the global level is here to support. So you can raise questions either through the MHPSS reference group or to us, and we can help facilitate further conversations between MHPSS reference groups and GBV coordinator groups that are working on PSS. So that's definitely something that we'd like to see a better relationship where it's mutually supportive. And I think the situation in Myanmar, where we had some support from the MHPSS team for some of the sessions, was very positive. And I know there's a great deal of interest, especially since COVID, I think it's been more recognized that it is important to look at our approaches dealing with intimate partner violence, and that has been a gap in the MHPSS reference group area. So there is a lot of interest now to see how we can work better together. So if no questions or further comments, I will move us to our next presentation, which is our final, but then we do have probably a little bit of time for any other business. So hold on to your thoughts if you have something you want to add at the end. And so now we're going to look at the findings from Plan and WRC's child marriage research into diverse settings. And we have Katherine Gambir from WRC, Women's Refugee Committee, and Clare Lofthouse from Plan International. And as with the previous, feel free to write comments or questions in the chat as we go along. And also feel free to write down your questions and raise your hand at the end or ask questions. So over to the next presenters. I don't know who's presenting first, so.
Thanks so much. Thanks both. I just want to check, Katherine, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Thanks so much for sharing the slides, Claire. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having us. My name is Katherine Gambir. I'm a senior research advisor at the Women's Refugee Commission, and I'm joined here with my colleague, Clare Lofthouse from Plan International. She is the initiative lead for the Child Marriage in Humanitarian Settings initiative. So as Jen mentioned, we'll be sharing findings from a global research study on the drivers of child marriage into humanitarian settings. Next slide, please. Next slide. It's not, oh, there we go. Okay, thanks. So Plan, the WRC, and the national research partners conducted a two-country, girl-centered, community-based research study to identify how the drivers of child marriage change as a result of crisis, and to investigate and unpack the system of support required to prevent, respond, and mitigate the impact of child marriage in humanitarian settings. We used a mixed methods participatory approach to collect and analyze data, which included desk reviews for each country, 43 key informant interviews with institutional stakeholders and service providers, participatory group activities with different community groups, as well as Sensemaker, which I'll describe in the next slide. We also held co-design and co-analysis workshops at the community level, as well as among other institutional stakeholders and national experts. And you'll see here the participants in the study, which included close to 4,000 community members across both settings. We conducted this research in Resiliency, Zimbabwe, and in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. And I'll describe a bit more about the humanitarian context in each of these settings in a next slide. So in terms of Sensemaker, I believe some of you are familiar with the Sensemaker methodology. It has been used in other GBV studies in humanitarian settings, including even some studies on child marriage. This method is a mixed method research and analysis tool that enables respondents to share open-ended stories about their lived experiences. So in practical terms, it's a survey tool that is loaded onto a tablet device, and the participant is invited to share a story based on a story prompt with the data collector, and their story is then recorded. So stories can be general, told in third person, or just be a personal story. So you can see here, these were the two story prompts that we used. The first in the Zimbabwe and the second in the Philippines. So since the story prompt is open-ended, as you can see there, it invites respondents or storytellers to share a story about their own lived experience, someone they know, or something that they've heard about that has happened in their community. And next, the storyteller responds to a series of visual prompts, such as what you see on the right-hand side of the screen, who is responsible for the actions in your story. And these responses give further meaning to their own story. And it creates a space for participants to choose what data they share, and also analyze the story and the information that they shared. So really centering respondents in the research process. Next slide, please. So as I'm just waiting for the slide, we'll move in a moment. So we conducted, as I mentioned, this research in the Sredzi district in southern Zimbabwe. It is a chronically food insecure area that's prone to climate-related shocks, including droughts, as well as in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao in the Philippines. And this region has experienced recurrent internal violence, displacement, as well as extreme weather events. Next slide, please. You'll notice that we have those audios. So if there's time at the end of the presentation, we'd love to share some audio recordings from our study that are stories that were shared by adolescent girls. But just to make sure we get through the content first, we'll hold off on that. So next, I'll discuss some of the key findings from the study. And we, as Claire will mention later on in the presentation, we do have a lot of materials, and we've published 2 research reports and executive summaries, research snapshots of sorts that detail the findings of our study. But for the presentation today, for you all, we're just honing in on 3 particular key areas that we believe will be most relevant to this group. So next slide. Great, thanks so much. So what did we learn that was unique to displacement settings? The first, and this information is primarily coming from the data that we collected in the Philippines, given that it was a displacement setting due to internal conflict, as well as recurrent climate shocks and crises. So we learned that in certain displacement contexts within the Philippines, parents force their daughters to marry members of the host family, in turn for sheltering the family. So forced marriages by parents included even marriage to older male cousins and other male relatives. The second was the Humanitarian Assistance mechanism. So this occurred in emergency shelters and transitory centers in displacement settings where we conducted the data in the Philippines. So the provision of the humanitarian assistance incentivized families to marry off their daughters to create a separate family unit, which would then go on to receive a separate aid package. And the third, in again, these emergency shelters and transitory centers that were set up by the humanitarian community for displaced families, also provided an opportunity for increased interaction among adolescents, which was reported by participants to increase girls' risk to marriage, given parents' fear of threat to the family honor. So this is intrinsically linked also to family honor, as well as controlling adolescent girl sexuality and those aspects driving child marriage. Next slide, please. So in Sredzi, Zimbabwe, we also investigated the relationship between child marriage and food insecurity. So we learned that food insecurity was among other factors of poverty and unmet basic needs that increased girls' risk of marriage. Food insecurity coupled by other factors, mainly domestic violence, so violence perpetrated by the girls' parents primarily, especially their fathers, pushed girls to marry, and these were self-initiated marriages, as a means to escape hunger in the home. Married girls also faced heightened food insecurity. They often relied on their parents for food assistance and other support to meet their basic needs. And finally, married girls also experienced deprivation of food by their husbands as a form of coercive control of their behaviors. Next slide, please. And finally, one of the dominant themes, particularly in the study we conducted in Zimbabwe, was the association between child marriage and other forms of gender-based violence. So as just discussed, married girls in Trans-D face deprivation of resources such as food, also restricted mobility, which was also seen, and a dominant trend in the data in the Philippines as well. Married girls in Zimbabwe also were often abandoned by their husbands who migrated to work in South Africa. And these married girls resorted to sexual exploitation in the context of selling sex in order to meet basic needs and as survival mechanisms. And sexual violence against girls, namely rape, was also a dominant theme in the study data as well, particularly in the Zimbabwe study. As mentioned, a primary reason why girls initiated their own marriages was to escape abuse, domestic violence in their own homes. And married girls subsequently also face a physical and emotional violence, both by their husbands as well as their in-laws. And finally, we also looked at the existing protection system of support available to adolescent girls throughout all levels of the socio-ecological model. And particularly, we recognize that community-based protection systems did exist in both settings, but there were huge gaps in these systems, and particularly huge barriers were that they were under-resourced and a lack of capacity of service providers and staff to address the needs of adolescent girls, including married girls. And further, the GBV, child protection, and SRHR services were inadequate to meet the diverse and acute needs of adolescents in both settings. So next, Claire will take it over and discuss the key conclusions and implications of the study and next steps.
Thanks so much, Catherine. I've had off if I'm having some Brit problems, so if at any point, please just drop me a message. Yeah, so we've got, as Catherine has alluded to, a really rich data set and a lot of information. And so I just want to share some sort of, I suppose, top line conclusions. Study really conclude marriage in humanitarian settings, as we've seen in all of the settings, really is underpinned by gender and socioeconomic inequality, which is
Hi, Claire, did we lose you?
Definitely not hearing her.
Okay, I'll Skype her, and if not, then I can share my screen and finish the presentation. Let's see. Sorry about that. Oh, hi there, Claire.
Kicked me out.
Ooh,
Yes,
we don't have very good sound.
Oh. Okay. Just.
I don't know why we're having like technical issues today. So I feel like all the PowerPoints have been super slow, so it must be.
I'm not sure. Can you hear me now?
Not really.
Not great, Claire. I'm happy to share my screen and post the slides.
I can even come back, or can you hear me okay?
Sorry, Claire, can you say that again?
I think she said was going out and coming back in.
Okay.
I mean, I didn't really understand any more than you said.
Okay, that's what I thought too. We'll
like
see.
what she said. Because she came on, she was the first person to arrive and she was super clear. So I don't know what happened.
Yeah. Maybe with the camera. Okay, she said left and coming back. Perhaps don't use your camera. And I'll take off my camera as well. It may just be the bandwidth. I'll also suggest that I share my screen.
Yeah, that makes a difference. Yeah.
If not, I can present the slides. Okay. Let's see, I'll go ahead and just, I have so many windows open, so let me shut down some so I don't have the same issue. Thanks for your patience, everyone.
I'm so sorry. No.
Hi, Claire.
Hi, can you hear me now? Is that any better? No.
It's a bit better for me. What do others think?
Keep talking and we'll see what happens. Yeah.
It's not clear.
Okay. Maybe let me try joining from my phone. Let me see if that makes any better. Sorry, Catherine. Do you want to share your screen and I'll join you in a second?
Yes, I'm sharing my screen. I'm on the conclusion slide.
Happening. Is that any better now? Can you hear me?
Yes, it's better. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, much better.
So continue my headphones in. I'm so sorry about that. Again, but I think
I think you were better without your headphones. Is what you
marriage in
changed with your
humanitarian
headphones.
settings, as in all other settings, is underpinned by gender and socioeconomic.
No, it's not working.
Claire, sorry, we can't hear you well. Is it okay if I take the slides and then you can, yeah, we could see if your connection is better towards the Q&A and sort of add things in the chat that I may miss. Oh, see. Okay. Okay, I think Claire may be coming back again. Thanks everyone for your patience. So I think we have the first point that we found in this study, as well as it's corroborated with existing evidence on the underlying drivers or the root causes of child marriage, is gender inequality. In addition to other key drivers, which include poverty and lack of access to stable income generating activities. Again, we'll share links to our research reports, and you can find our other key drivers, which manifested differently within each setting as well as across settings, which really highlights the importance of community-led and gender transformative programming to address and respond to child marriage. We also learned that the key drivers of child marriage were exacerbated by crises. This also includes the lack of access to quality education and lack of alternatives to marriage. You can also read in our report, given that we conducted the study during COVID-19, we also learned that similarly COVID-19 exacerbated these risks and drivers of child marriage as well, by the lockdowns, closing of schools, and closing economic markets, among others, including exacerbating violence within the home and food insecurity in terms of the Zimbabwe context. And we also learned, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, that these specific dimensions of the crisis and context led to new drivers and risks re-emerging. So this has to do with the humanitarian assistance mechanism, the change of these different community norms and structures, and new ways of living, for example, in the emergency shelters and transitory centers in the Philippines. And we've already made a note previously on another key driver, which is controlling adolescent girls' sexuality to protect family honor. So the next slide. So based on these findings, our key conclusions are as follows. We learned that in addition to forced marriages by girls' parents, girls are also initiating their own marriages. And this is due to the experience of violence and poverty in their home and the lack of alternative opportunities for marriage. In addition to, of course, within a broader context of gender inequality and socioeconomic inequality. We also learned and investigated the resiliency and adaptive capacities of adolescent girls in both settings. And we learned that, yes, girls are resilient. Even the fact that they're initiating their own marriages, this is part of their survival skills to escape this violence and poverty that they're experiencing in their home. And they do possess potential to overcome all these challenges that they're facing, as long as there is a system of support around them to help protect them from child marriage and other risks. We also investigated the lived experiences of married girls, as well as their key concerns, which includes cyclical poverty, which negatively influences their decision-making within the home and their navigation and access to resources and opportunities. We also investigated adverse health and well-being outcomes, including poor reproductive health outcomes, mental health outcomes, and gender-based violence, as we discussed earlier, as well as their limited and lack of education. So overall, we conclude that community and particularly adolescent-led gender transformative programming is really essential to mitigate the increased risks and impact of child marriage. We also, in our research reports, present a number of recommendations for humanitarian practitioners. The first is around supporting communities to implement gender transformative and community-led programming. So this means providing technical assistance to communities, community-based organizations, national-led organizations to design, implement, and evaluate programming. And ensuring that this is gender transformative to address the root causes of child marriage. Also, it is key to understand the diversities among girls, including those at risk, those married, diverse, widowed, and other intersecting risk and protective factors. We also recommend that we focus on strengthening and filling the gaps in adolescent girls' capacities to mitigate their risks and adverse consequences of child marriage, as well as to increase the capacity of girls' families and their communities, and really hone in on these existing community child protection mechanisms that already exist to support and care for adolescents. Just a few other points here, and then we can wrap up the presentation. So we're also recommending multi-sectoral and multi-level programming. And we are promoting that there should be better coordination and prioritization across sectors for child marriage programming. And to focus more on not just the prevention, but also the response to child marriage. So working and targeting programming specifically for married adolescent girls. And finally, we uncovered that there's a need, and we hope to fill the gap in this need for practice-informed and evidence-based programmatic guidance. So as we've been mentioning throughout the presentation, we have these following research reports that we will share with you, which you can review for additional information about our findings and recommendations. And finally, in terms of next steps, we are working in collaboration with Save the Children and HRC at UC Berkeley to develop a theories of change and programmatic models that will be tailored and contextualized to different humanitarian settings to inform project design, development, and adaptation for prevention and response programming across sectors. we're also developing a technical brief that synthesizes the findings and implications for practitioners to prevent and respond to child marriage in humanitarian settings. And finally, developing a journal article that investigates the linkages between food insecurity and child marriage. For additional information, you can contact us, and our emails are here and available to you. Great. Any questions? Thanks so much again for hanging in with us and being patient.
I see Fulvia had made a comment. Fulvia, do you want to expand a little bit and just say that?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Yes. Hi. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I was when you were talking about the drivers, how some have that there are new drivers based on the conflict situations, etc. One of the things that we also noted in the Syria context is that child marriage is kind of used now to somehow formalize a situation that is happening because of overcrowding in IDP camps. So basically, because more people live together in the same household, then in order to formalize this cohabiting situation, they just organize marriages so that it becomes more acceptable. So I wanted to share that as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sylvia. And definitely overcrowding came up and is related actually to this, like the provision of humanitarian assistance and creating separate family units to receive additional aid, as well as this third point here around increased interactions among adolescents. And this also has to do with overcrowding and also quote unquote mixing of adolescent boys and adolescent girls. It's interesting that you note the cohabitation. And actually in the Zimbabwe context, cohabitation was perceived as marriage. So sort of informal marriage, but certainly marriage. And oftentimes if girls were even rumored to be walking home from school with their boyfriend or even another male peer, or if they missed their curfew, then their parents would chase their girls away from their home and essentially force them to live with their boyfriends, and that would be considered marriage, just this cohabitation. And another point on that, because I think it's important for the humanitarian structure, is that that is something that could be a immediate intervention, right? So we also learned in the Philippines context that the design of the shelter units were such that, yes, similar to what you said in Syria, there was a lot of overcrowding and mixing even among families, and therefore a greater risk of adolescent girls to experience sexual violence. So the shelter design should be co-designed with families themselves so that they are appropriate for the social norms of the displaced families.
I had a quick question. You mentioned that one of the drivers was family violence, especially by the fathers towards the daughters.
Yeah.
And that they got married. Was there any study done on if actually in reality their situation in terms of violence towards them got any better when they got remarried, or did they just end up in another situation of violence and abuse?
Yeah, so this is essentially we didn't follow participants over time. However, the trends in the data and do show us that there experience of violence is not mitigated when girls are married. They experience violence not only from their husbands, but also their in-laws. So some of the forms of violence they're experiencing is both physical violence, emotional violence, abandonment, and also, as noted in the food insecurity side as well, this deprivation of resources and opportunities. So deprivation of food, deprivation of access to school, and participation in the workplace as well. But it's not causal, like the study wasn't designed to follow participants over time. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question before we end? I'm sorry, we're not going to have time to listen to the recordings. But if you can share the PowerPoint, then we will make that available to people. Any other questions or comments? So you're getting lots of positive. Okay, you have a question here from Emily. Regarding number 3, understanding the diversities among girls, how did you find this information and how did you use this information?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, we collected information on marital status, on relationship status, education, whether the girls worked or not, gender, so a whole myriad of different diversity factors. And then we disaggregated data in our analysis to look at, for example, the specific experiences or stories of married girls. And then through the Sensemaker online dashboard, we were also able to then look at subgroups of girls and understand how those particular subgroups responded to these different visual prompts or their responses to different questions that added layers of meaning to the data, as well as some other multiple choice questions. So these are all reflected in the findings, and you can look at our 80+ page research reports that provide additional information about all the diversity of the girls and how we're using that to inform our data, and also they'll link to our recommendations.
I don't know if you can you hear me now? Is it clear?
Yes.
Yeah, it is clear. Go ahead.
Great timing. I just saw that there was one question in the chat about peer groups. And I think it's something that we didn't really touch on in this presentation, but I think we really identified from both studies that you know, when there's a lack of peer interaction or spaces for adolescents to really interact in a safe way, then that really often led to quite harmful outcomes, in that they were really missing that support from their peers to sort of have that closeness, to have a space to discuss their issues, to get that essential friendship and support that's necessary. And then we also saw in another way from some incidental stories coming out that actually some peer networks were encouraging child marriages in a way that it was sort of, you know, giving you a social status, and why would you wait? And, you know, if you get married, your husband is going to give you X, Y, Z and ABC. So then it sort of, you know, you saw these, both the positive side of peer support to encourage girls and boys not to enter into child marriages, you know, to as much as they had a choice. And then the other side that really kind of isolated girls who weren't married and kind of encouraged them to then seek out a marriage because it was sort of what all of their peers were also doing. So as Katherine said, there's more information in both the reports, and luckily there is also executive summaries because the data set was really big, so there was a lot of information to say. And then the synthesis report of the findings will be available in the next couple of weeks. So we'll circulate all those links through the various networks with everybody. And thanks so much, and sorry again for my technical challenges today.
Just trying to look quickly if there are any other questions. It was super interesting. Thank you for sharing. And I know the issue of child marriage is something that we've been discussing, and that has come up quite a bit. In fact, it was one of the issues that was raised when we started the CASI, or Child Adolescent Initiative. And I think it was an issue that we were often asked to provide more information on. So I think this study will be well received. And it's also reminding me, I think actually there are different examples of programming out there that have been successful in different ways. I know, I think Reem was on at the beginning from Gaziantep, but they have a program for adolescent mothers. So it would reach some of the population that you're talking about, you know, after they're married. They don't quite, if they're girls, fit in yet to some of the safe spaces that are more focused on women rather than on adolescents. So we might, you know, look at if this is a topic people would like more on, we could have some presentations. Sometimes we do a thematic call, so we could do one talking about programming around girls and child marriage, married and unmarried, if that's of interest. Please do give us feedback if there's topics you would like for us to include. I'm also looking forward to SVRI coming up. Maybe we can all be scouters, and if there's something we find particularly interesting, invite them to come and appear on one of our monthly calls. So that's another opportunity to get some fresh ideas into our calls. So thank you all. And I know you guys have been waiting for a while to present, so I'm glad you were finally able to be here. And also thank you to Alina and to Eri for your presentation. It's great that we had two research topics, very exciting. So thank you to our academic partners, as well as to, yeah, I don't know where WRC has its own sort of status, I think, within as an organization. So, and thank you also Plan and UNFPA Myanmar. So thanks everyone. I'm glad that you appeared during the beginning of the summer holiday, and we will definitely be providing the information that you received into our next monthly update. And I think we'll also see if we can provide some of the recordings from some of the different seminars that have been happening. I see Fulvia has her hand up. Fulvia, go ahead, because I had promised an AOB, so go ahead.
Sorry, thank you. I just wanted to mention that we have started this campaign in the Arab states, which is called "This is Not Normal," is to push back on the normalization of gender-based violence. It was launched by UNFPA Executive Director on the 19th of June. And I mean, it's a bit of a call to anyone who would want to participate. It's mainly maybe even members of the yourself, Jennifer, or members of the GBV AoR, or anyone else who would like to participate. It would be sharing with us your interest, and then we can share a short script, and then you do a video with that script, and then we would put together the video with these formats that you see already in here. We are focusing for now on the Arab region, but there were discussions on opening up to other regions. We can't really take on the responsibility to create all the videos for all regions, but definitely if you want to expand these beyond the Arab states, more than welcome, because as said, also UNFPA ED is on and is aware and has launched it. So thank you.
Thank you. I also want to give a shout out to Shiva, who's always behind the scenes on these calls and organizes all the speakers and deals with all the technical issues. And she's at the GBV IE course right now in Greece. Today's her day off, so she's working on her day off, but we're really excited that she's part of that course, since that's one of the sort of AOR good practices, I would say. And also I want to just appreciate that Gloria Soma is here. She's one of our new core members from a women-led organization in South Sudan. And she also, after, oh my God, like 17, 18-hour flight, went to the call to action meeting and met with the GBV AoR. So we're really excited that she's here as well. And great to see, as we said, faces that we haven't seen for a while and new faces coming for the first time in all of our many coordinators. And I see we have Ekaterina also, who's from the Ukraine humanitarian emergency. So thank you all for coming, and we will let you know what's our next call. For now, we are planning to still have the call at the end of July for those of you who can make it. So thank you all for joining, and have a good rest of your day, whatever time it is for you in your region. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Bye, everyone. It was very enriching today.
Bye.